Welcome back. I'm Gary Bowles. For those of you who just joined us, I'm the host for Global Skills Day, chair for the future work with Singularity University, and a partner in Charrette LLC, which is producing the event. And our producer and my business partner and wife, Heidi Kleinmaus, has suggested that you've heard plenty from me. So I need to hand the reins off to me, one of the most amazing and capable people I know. And that's Mel Ochoa, the
Wow.
COO
Hi,
of
Gary.
Ventures. So I selfishly wanted to make sure that I had the chance to talk to Mel before you took the reins, because I look for any excuse that we have to be able to connect. So thank you.
Wow. I don't want to say your wife is wrong, but it's good to take over the reins from you. It's always good to see you, and I cherish our partnership.
All right, so I just want to point out to people, if you have not checked out what Mel and Zeev Klein have done with Social Innovation Summit, I just want to encourage everybody here. I think one of the things that we've seen, Mel, is as we've gone from the in-person events that you and I have produced for forever to now, when unfortunately have gone completely virtual, and eventually will be something that people will unfortunately call hybrid.
Yeah.
But what we've done is we've sort of opened up the audience. And what you've done with Social Innovation Summit, I just want to point out, I've mentioned to people before that I was the co-founder of SOCAP, which I think of as a sister event. But what you've done a tremendous job in doing is bringing together such a variety of different people, sort of different facets of the diamond of the impact community. And you've been able to engage corporates, engage NGOs, engage corporations, engage brand names, like the Shaquille O'Neals of the world, and do all of that in such an authentic and human way to bring
Wow.
attention to some of the biggest things that we need to change. And you've been uniquely focused on education and work issues yourself. And so I just wanted to
Well,
thank
thank
you for
you.
all that work and make sure people know about that work so they can also plug in themselves.
It's absolutely a team effort. We have a whole team at Landmark Ventures. Zeev Klein is definitely a great leader, great visionary, but we try to make it a little bit of business, a little bit of party, a little bit of celebrity, a little bit of just curiosity, all rolled into one. And we not only have the large summit in June, every June, but we have a whole slate of events throughout the year. Would welcome anybody, but Gary, it's always great to have you at our events.
Well, no, absolutely. And you've done some of these learning journeys in different cities, I think you've done. We talk a lot. We use the word ecosystem almost too much in a lot of the sessions today. But you have to pull together that ecosystem and to focus on some of the thorniest issues of our time, but also to build a community around it. So
Yeah.
one of the things I did want to make sure I'm helping people to understand, though, is you've had a consuming interest in education. So just tell people briefly about your background and why you're so passionate about that. And then, because so much of your work is focused on the organization, and those are going to be some of the people that you're talking to today are, sort of organizational change makers, how you
Right.
think of as the way organizations can also have an impact.
Yeah, well, in a nutshell, I worked for an organization where one of the big themes was education equals freedom at Achievement First. And I think that really followed me throughout my life. As a kid, I didn't have opportunity given to me because of my zip code or because of my family. And I think education was the magic wand, if you will, that really provided me open doors, as well as a very strong-willed mother who told me to get in shape and do good things. But education really opened doors, and that carried through. I started in early childhood education way back at the Bay Area Discovery Museum in the Bay Area in Sausalito, and then a few other ways involved in education, and then Achievement First, and then now at Landmark Ventures and through Social Innovation Summit, I'm able to connect with a range of experts and leaders to think about education, to think about the future of work, the future of learning, etc. And it's just been such a privilege to rub elbows with people out there doing great work to prepare our learners for the future.
And I think increasingly so much of the focus is on helping organizations to become learning organizations themselves, and then to be much more inclusive, have greater impact. So, and I know that your next three guests will each have sort of different perspectives on that. So I'm going to actually jump out of the way and let you take it from here, and hope you have some fascinating conversations ahead of you.
Great. Well, thank you, Gary.
All right, talk to you soon.
Hi, Charlene. How are you?
Hey Mel, good to see you.
Good to see you. I should say again, because you and I actually met in 1999 when you were an analyst way back when. And I was just, a startup person out in the Bay Area. And it's taken 20 years for us to come back together. So
Well, no
I
time
think
better than the present.
you've become a lot smarter and I've just become a lot older looking. So good to see you again. So our mini session here is focused on skills for leadership in a post-COVID world. I know you have a book that is recent, your new book. I know in 2008, one of my favorite books was Groundswell. It really changed my thinking around marketing or as a marketing person. But for this book, obviously disruption is in the title, but can you give us a little bit of a top line overview?
Sure. Yeah, I wrote the book and published it back in the fall of 2019, just before the pandemic hit. And
Okay.
the question I was trying to answer is, why is it that some organizations can transform and they seemingly do this over and over again, are constantly disrupting themselves and then the marketplaces? What is it in their special sauce? What is it in the water that they drink? What is it that they do that enables them? And by studying this, maybe we could learn something from it too as well. And I
Yeah.
was very keen not to just take the Silicon Valley darlings. I have a bank, I have a college, university, even an art museum as examples in the book.
Wow. Yeah, I've always thought people always default to Silicon Valley or Silicon Alley or the tech entrepreneur as that shining model, but there's so much disruption or at least paradigm shifts happening in medicine and elsewhere. I will say though, some people might look at the book of the title and think, well, disruption, that's a bad thing. Doesn't that mix things up too much or really uh, deconstruct things too much? Isn't
Well,
disruption something to avoid?
yeah, well, I think we need to have a new relationship with disruption. Instead of trying to avoid it and make sure our lives are not disrupted, we have to acknowledge that the fact that any change that's going to be worth doing is going to be hard. It is going to be disruptive. And so I think of it as a potentially positive force because look at the pandemic. It was such a hard experience for us, but it forced us to do things that we would otherwise never have done. We
Right.
did in 5 or 7 days what it would have taken 5 or 7 years to do.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think we held a webinar last year with the chancellor of the Pennsylvania state system, and he said that, and this was maybe July, August-ish last year, he said that the things that they were able to do in 2 months, he normally wouldn't be able to do in 5, 6 years in terms of just the turnaround, in terms of the technology that it was able to provide, etc. So it has forced us to do new things. Even being on Zoom as much as we are now has really forced us to do new things. When we think of that as part of disruption, how do you balance, like, help me understand innovation and disruption? What are the connectors? How are they different? How do you balance the two?
Right. I think of innovation as a lifeblood of change. And yet, when you look at the way innovation is constructed inside of most organizations, we want it to be the smooth, predictable, understandable, not disruptive process.
Right.
Is to try to take the disruption out of it. And what happens is we go to these innovation labs that are doing such great work. We go and go, ooh, look at this great stuff. We applaud and cheer. And then we walk out the doors to reality and nothing has changed
Yeah.
because we don't want the disruption. Disruption is an honest conversation about what it's actually going to take for that innovation to actually make a difference. And until we embrace disruption and really say, this is what it's going to take, because frankly, we can't get to where we need to be by incrementally advancing just within the confines of our comfort zones.
Right. Yeah. How do you think of it, since you've studied this so much and talked to so many experts, where I'm very much of the mindset that everything can be changed, but you do have big systems. Like today, we're talking about education or learning. Education is such a big system, and sometimes you have to take it district by district or at a federal level, a national level, etc. How have you seen others or you yourself, when you think of such a big system, almost too big to change, how does disruption play into that?
Well, I use the example of Southern New Hampshire University as a great disruptive force. They realized that their students, their future students, were not your traditional 18-year-old coming in. They were the career professionals, people coming back from the military, so many different types of learners. And they were filling this need by going online. So they started going online 25 years ago. And today they're serving 150,000 students online with accredited degrees from an
Wow.
accredited university, largest provider of online degrees in the world. Not
Wow.
Harvard, not Stanford, not MIT, but little Southern New Hampshire
Wow.
University. What gave them the right to be disruptive?
Yeah.
It was a leader who said, I see a need, I can marshal the resources together, and I will build it. And 100% focus on the student outcomes. That's how you disrupt education.
I think you and I have a tech industry background a little bit, you more than me, meaning a little. Disruption, you hear that term all the time in Silicon Valley, and everyone's trying to be disruptive, like it's the cool thing and become a unicorn. But what truly makes a disruptive leader out of all the leaders that think of themselves as leaders or are even leaders of good startups or good companies? But what sets someone apart to be a truly disruptive leader?
Yeah, I researched this. I asked 1,000 leaders various characteristics and behaviors that they had, and there were two things that came out for the people who were truly disruptive. And by disruptive, I mean they were able to create exponential change,
Yeah.
not just blow things up, but actually make a difference, a change for the better. And the first one was obviously to see a change. They were open to change. They saw change as an opportunity, disruption as an opportunity. But the second one was they have a tremendous ability to lead people, especially to inspire, to bring people into a movement.
Yeah.
They were creating movements in their organizations and in their industries, gathering people around, elevating leaders around them so that they could carry on the mantle of this disruption. They didn't see themselves at the front. They were in many ways creating the conditions for hundreds, if not thousands of people to become disruptive leaders themselves.
Yeah. So it's interesting you say the organization, the DNA of the organization is part of that disruption just as much as the leader. What is one thing perhaps that a leader could do to help their organizations be more disruptive? Because as these companies grow bigger and bigger, it's so hard to move them in one direction or another. How do you create that DNA? I guess it's a two-part question. One, as it's growing up, right, in startup mode, but then also at the 1,000-person level, how do you still keep those fires burning?
Yeah. Now, the first question, what is the source of that fire? It has to be a really clear vision of what that future looks like. And in particular, who your future customer is. If I go into organizations and as I begin an engagement working with the teams, and I would like to walk around and ask people, so who is your future customer? And the vast majority cannot tell me. Or if they can, they have 8 different versions of that customer. If you don't know what the future looks like, how can you start aiming for it? How will you make the decisions today, those really hard decisions today, to potentially move away from your current customer and go after the future? The further out into the future you can see and align everyone around that one singular feature, the better chances are you're being disruptive.
Yeah.
And then the organization, the culture is what drives it. It's the strategy, is your roadmap of where you're headed towards with that future. Then your engine is your culture that determines how fast you can go down that road.
Mm-hmm.
And we all have beliefs that hold us back from being focused on that customer of the future. Things we say to ourselves, like, well, we need permission, or we have to be perfect, or I'm just a fill in the blank. I can't make any change. My organization's too big to turn. No organization's too big to turn. You just have to have the will and then systematically decide where are those roadblocks, where are the sticking points that keep us from turning.
Right. As we think about culture, especially right now, since it's almost a digital culture, there is no office culture. What makes a culture disruptive? As you know, you said you wrote the book in 2019. What have you learned since in terms of a disruptive culture?
Well, you change culture by changing either your beliefs or your behaviors, ideally both. And so what Zoom did and what the pandemic did, it changed our behaviors. And then that started changing our beliefs of what does collaboration really look like? What is the definition of a working relationship? What's the definition of an office, right? It's my home, it's my office now. What's the definition even of culture? And so when you have these behaviors and beliefs coming together, then it's really understanding, well, what kind of culture do we want? What kind of company do we want? What kind of relationship do we want with each other?
Yeah.
We don't think about work in terms of relationships. We think about it as a physical space and manifestation. It's not a physical space.
Yeah.
It's not even this Zoom room. It's like, how do we relate to each other? How much do we trust each other? And the three beliefs of a disruptive organization are openness, agency, and a bias for action. And if anything, the pandemic has brought that even more to be true. That the organizations that had a lot of structure, it's kind of counterintuitive. You need more structure to be open.
Right.
You need clearer definitions of process in order to have a bias for action and to encourage people to have agency. So companies really started taking culture really seriously when the culture had to be completely redefined because of the pandemic.
Strengthened in a lot of different ways, a lot of new ways. Well, as you think of the learners who are attending today or listening today, the viewers, what's one thing that they could take away and take back to their company or their organization or their group to maybe be disruptive or help that culture of disruption?
Right. I would say don't wait to be a leader for a title to actually create that change. You are a leader because you aspire to create change. And then you inspire people, you bring them in to follow you to help create that change. So my one thing is go find something to change and make that change happen. This is how you get to be a better disruptive leader, is by actually creating the disruption. And you know you're doing it right. And people around you is just like, why are you causing all this chaos and confusion? And then this is the very important part, be clear about what it is that you're trying to change. They don't understand it and you're not being clear, it's on you.
Yeah.
And repeat it over and over and over again. You can't say it just once and expect people to have heard it.
Yeah. I'm going to throw a little bit of a curveball to you. Who is a disruptive leader in history that you would love to work with? Someone who just did it right, who you think in the back of your head, wow, this is the title character of my book here.
You know, I'm going to go way back in history and look at people like Jesus Christ and Muhammad. And because you think about, you know, disrupting beliefs, disrupting and challenging powers, that be the Roman Empire, for example, because you draw people to an idea that was centered on people and on relationships. To have been able to witness and see that. True masters of disruption, of creating movements, would have been wonderful to see. Like, how did they do that?
Yeah. I guess last question, because I know we're at time here, but when you look to the future, in again for attendees viewing, what's your outlook? What's next in terms of what people should be thinking about in a post-COVID world? Hopefully, once we get there.
I think I'm going to go back to that relationship. Oftentimes when we're thinking about relationships with each other, or in a hiring situation, if we're starting up or something, we oftentimes think about, okay, hire, train, and retain, and that's it. Well, what if you were to think about that relationship as different? And I'll give you an example. When we begin a new job, we oftentimes say, okay, great, come on in. This, you know, we're going to like work together. But we know in the back of our minds, we're just wondering, when is this person going to leave me? And the other person's thinking, I'll stay here for as long as it works for my purposes, and then I'm out of here. But we know the relationship is going to end, but we never talk about it.
Right.
I mean, how are you supposed to have integrity? So I have a saying, we're going to talk about the day you leave, the day you start. From the day one, we're going to have an honest conversation. We're going to build our relationship based on integrity. The fact that at some point, this isn't going to work out anymore. You have grown, we have grown. And let's talk to each other, stay in communication so that when that day comes, we have a long runway. I'll do everything to meet your needs. You'll do everything to help make the organization a success. And when the time comes for you to go in a different direction, I will make available my entire network to help you be successful and find your next job. In return, I'm going to ask that you help me find your replacement, someone who does it better than you, and to train them.
Right.
That,
It's such a good open conversation to have.
yeah, it's sort of a no, it's the way we want to have a
Right.
relationship at work.
Yeah,
We never
absolutely.
have that conversation.
This was wonderful. Thank you so much for spending the time. I will see you in another 20 years, hopefully sooner, but thank you so much. And go buy the book. I'm gonna read it. Disruption. It's such an important word. So thank you, Charlene.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Hi there. How are you?
Good, Mel. How are you? Hoping you can
Great.
see.
Thanks for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Sure, my pleasure. It's great to be here with you. And what a great event Gary is,
Yeah.
and the team have pulled together.
It's a packed agenda. It's enough to have one track throughout a day. They have 3 tracks plus keynotes plus everything. And so quite a busy day, but thank you for joining us. You are just putting out a new book, and this session title is Envisioning a World of Work Without Jobs. What is the new book? Can you give us a little bit of an overview just so that we can be thinking about the right thing here with you?
Sorry, Mel, you cut out right there. I think it was when the camera was joining. Could I trouble you repeat the last?
Yeah, not a problem.
15 seconds.
Yeah, well, I was just mentioning that you have a new book coming out.
Mm-hmm.
And our session here, or our conversation, is around envisioning a world of work without jobs. But can you give us a little bit of an overview of your book, just so that we have some context in terms of what you're thinking about right now?
Yeah, absolutely. We actually put out back in the spring an article of the same name in Sloan Management Review. And essentially, Mel, the book builds on the last 2 books I've written, Lead the Work, Navigating a World Beyond Employment, as well as Reinventing Jobs. And what John Boudreau and I are attempting to do in this book is to introduce a new work operating system, one that is going to be much more responsive to the dramatic changes of the 21st century, specifically the rapid proliferation of automation, as well as the democratization of work. And really, consistent with the theme of the day, ensure that skills are the currency of work. Mm-hmm. So it prescribes a 4-step approach for starting with the work and not the existing jobs, because of all the frictional costs associated with work being done in jobs, which we can probably have a much longer conversation about. Ensuring then, once we understand the work, we get to the optimal combinations of humans and automation, because that is going to be sort of an eternal quest for us, I think, going forward. And then ensuring that when we think of connecting the talent to the work, we're looking at a whole variety of different ways of engaging that talent in the work. It could be a job, it could be a gig, it could be a freelance assignment, it could be through an alliance partner, it could be through an outsourced provider. And then ensuring that we're finding a way for talent to flow to work more seamlessly, rather than being limited to this legacy notion of just fixed traditional jobs.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that now. And I would love to get your take on the world around us, where not yet post-COVID, but moving out of COVID, crossed fingers. A lot of people are saying, if you're not going to give me the flexibility that I've had and I'm still productive, I've shown you in the last year or so, I'm going to leave and go someplace else. How is that? How are you thinking about that? How are companies going to get the workforce if maybe they're out of alignment with what employees want?
Yeah, Mel, I think every day we're realizing how much this pandemic has really changed so many of our frames of reference. Satya Nadella, I think, said it well back in, I think it was June or July, where he said, a 2-year trend in digitalization has been realized in 2 months. And I actually think the impact on the future of work is far more profound. It's more like 5 years, because what you have is not just the rapid proliferation of digitalization and tools like what we're on now. It's this other force called the democratization of work. And if you think of what we threw up into the air is everything to do with where work was done and when it's done. And, we kind of broke through a 50-year barrier, right? You can remember, if you're as old as I am, Alvin Toffler writing about in 1970 this notion of electronic cottages. And in 50 years, we made next to no progress. And then overnight, March last year, we went to something like 56% of people in this country working full-time remote. But I don't think it ends at just where work is done and when it's done. I think it extends, and we're seeing this play out dramatically and rapidly to how work is done, what the work itself is, and who's doing the work. And increasingly also, and kind of an underpinning for the Great Resignation, as it's been called, is the question of why is work done? Why am I working? How am I connected to your mission and your passion and your purpose as an organization?
Yeah. Just to bring an equity lens to it, you mentioned where work is done. Obviously, a lot of people, and we saw this so much during the pandemic, but it was an issue before the pandemic. A lot of people don't have that flexibility. So in your research and your thinking, how do you bring that equity lens to the conversation in terms of, well, what does that mean for people, with skills as a currency, as you mentioned? How do you think of DEI?
Yeah, really good question. I want to frame it in a couple of ways, Mel. I think for business leaders and HR leaders, the two most significant challenges that we're going to face, some would say, I would actually say opportunities, is one is how do we redesign work so we can connect talent to that work in as seamless a fashion as possible, regardless of the nature of the relationship, regardless of the sort of tenure of the person, et cetera, which really is the underpinning for the agile organization, right, where talent flows to work more seamlessly. The second part is how do we ensure that we are meeting people where they are, as opposed to your point about DEI, which I think is such a fundamental underpinning for much of how we shape work going forward, as opposed to forcing people to conform to where we are, how we want them to work, who we identify with, how much of themselves they can bring to work. And last year, I worked with a very large global pharmaceutical company that really embraced this mission and explicitly said, this pandemic gives us an opportunity to question, gives us a reason to question many of our beliefs about work. And one of those beliefs was that people had to be here to do the work. Could we achieve our diversity, equity, and inclusion objectives by casting a much wider net, by making it easier for people to engage with us, not on our terms, but on theirs? And I've actually made in the 6 months since they rolled out the strategy, dramatic improvements in their diversity metrics, but also it's had the benefit of driving the innovation culture that they had always thought underpinned their model, but hadn't realized how much of that innovation was being shut off because they weren't quite as inclusive and equitable as they might have been. Mm-hmm. And so we're starting to see that virtuous cycle that we all know exists.
Yeah. Thinking about skills as a currency, such an interesting concept. One of the things that I've seen a lot of people talk about is how to track that over time. I think throughout the day, others have been talking about lifelong learning. Obviously, you need some way to show as you progress what your skills are, and badges or whatever it might be. But what are your thoughts? What's going to work? What's the system that we need to put in place so that if skills are truly a currency, how do we use them? Or how do we show we have that value that you would as money in the bank?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think there are a couple of things that you need to demonstrate. I think certainly you have to demonstrate the acquisition of skills and the tracking of skills over time so you can show progression. But you also have to demonstrate application of those skills. And that is where I think it's important that in a real world sense that there is a consistent view. And the thing that I've been heartened by are the emerging technologies that many of us on this call are familiar with, right? So it's technologies like Eightfold and Globe and Hitch and others, where you do have the infrastructure to demonstrate that ability and have skills really be the currency of work. because you get to infer the skills of your workforce, you get to monetize those skills, you get to connect those skills to work. And what you have is kind of almost the equivalent of a skills passport, if you will, that gets baked into these organizations of not just the acquisition of skills, but the application of skills over time and across different domains.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about automation for a second here. For many, it's a scary word, but for others, automation is good for many reasons, but also the progress of automation. Some people think robots are going to take over in 5 years. Others think, well, it's going to be a slow progress and it's not going to be 100%. Where do you sit in all of this? What is automation as you related to skills? What's your thinking?
Yeah. Thank you for asking that question. And we touched on this in our third book, Reinventing Jobs. I think we as a species, right? If you go back and look over time, we as a species do two things consistently. We always overestimate the impact of new technologies in the short term, and we underestimate their impact in the long term. And I think the same is true with AI and various forms of automation. What we tried to do with Reinventing Jobs was actually demonstrate with about 130 case studies the nuanced impact of automation and how it really plays out in a real world sense. It doesn't destroy jobs. Neither is it that nirvana, which creates lots of jobs. Its impact is incredibly nuanced because it does three things. It substitutes certain highly repetitive rules-based work. It augments lots of other work, increasing the productivity of talent. And it also creates demand for new types of work. And all of this points out, the importance and essence of having a skills-based currency, because until you get from the job to the tasks and the underlying skills, you don't really understand how automation is going to affect work and thus either render some skills obsolete, change the application of others, or demand new skills for the world of work.
Yeah. I think there's progress there, right? It's a conversation around progress, and we're not going to stop. Progress is always going to exist. My concern is when the truck driver is now automated, where it's, I don't want to say it's eliminating a job, but you said, creating other opportunities. In your mind, how do we get them to go into other professions that are growing, like nursing or others that are in huge demand?
No, and the truck driver is the quintessential example of where the task is the job, right?
Right.
But I do think, though, that the thing that we need to look is beyond the stuff at the surface, right? Looking at what are the enabling skills this person has. So a truck driver is a great example. This is someone who has tremendous amount of discipline. This is someone who can stick to a schedule. This is someone who is self-motivated, and there are a whole set of other attributes. And I would ask the question of what are those attributes and other skills beyond the technical actually map to in terms of emerging bodies of work? Because I think we've all seen the examples of we can reskill the coal miners in West Virginia to be coders. And I suspect that for every one example of where you have a success story, there's probably 100 where it doesn't work. But I think looking at the enabling skills and that's why I think this narrative around skills is so important, because it forces us to think beyond the headlines, forces us to think beyond the sort of obvious thing of a truck driver and what he or she can do and what that maps to what are all of the things that surround this person? What's that unique bundle of capabilities that is this person?
Yeah, I always think of veterans as well, where they have such a range of deep and rich skills. But when they go into the, another sector, the private sector or whatever, it's always an unknown of how do we use these skills. So it's so nice to see a lot of companies doubling down on how to translate those skills into the workplace. So I think you're thinking the same thing. I do want to mention the book one more time, Work Without Jobs. How does this book advance the notion of skills as the currency of the labor market? Anything closing you want to mention?
Yeah, well, the book comes out next spring and it's being published by MIT. What it really does, Mel, is that it forces the narrative of where skills become the currency of work, and it illustrates the potential for the more agile enterprise, the more responsive enterprise and the more sustainable enterprise as a result of skills being the currency of work.
That's great. Very nice talking to you. We've never met. I would love to spend more time with you. This is wonderful. I feel so much smarter now after only 15 minutes. So I will pick up the book. I will read your other books and we will meet again. Thank you so much. This has been a pleasure.
Thank you, Mel. The pleasure was mine.
So as we transition into the next guest here, I can say that we're going to have a conversation around how we can empower leaders to build a better tomorrow for work and learning. A lot of leadership conversation here in terms of empowering leaders, a disruptive leader, leaders with skills. Hi, Kaila. How are you today?
Hi, Mel. I'm great. How are you?
I am wonderful. So I know you're in New Zealand, I believe. So it's morning.
Kia ora, hello from New Zealand. Yep, we are. I'm coming to you from the future. It's tomorrow.
Right. I think 9:30 or so tomorrow morning.
Yep. Correct.
And you brought Singularity University to New Zealand and Australia. I would love to touch on that for a few seconds. What was that experience like, and how has it been going in broadening it and developing it?
Yeah, it was incredible. So, I attended the Singularity University exec program in 2016, and I found it to be an incredibly powerful experience. I came away feeling like the material that was covered was so important and so relevant across, everything that we do, not only our economy, but also our government, our healthcare system, our education system. And I felt it was kind of almost unconscionable that, more people didn't have access to it. And so we brought it to New Zealand. In 2016, we ran the Singularity U New Zealand Summit that was pretty much a condensed version of the exec program across 3 days instead of 6. We shipped in a bunch of the amazing SU faculty and also had some incredible local presenters. And we had 1,400 people come along to that. And Wow. It really, I think, in many ways shifted the narrative about, I was hearing your conversation with Ravin, sorry if I pronounced that incorrectly, but listening to your conversation with him about that, overestimating what can happen in the short term and underestimating what happens in the long term. And I think a lot of people began to think a little bit differently about our trends and trajectories coming out of that experience.
Yeah. Wow. 1,400 people. That's a big win. Congratulations.
It was the biggest one in the world. It was at that time for little New Zealand. We were pretty proud of that, punching
That's
above
awesome.
our weight.
So I know you think a lot about professional skills. Some people call them soft skills or future-proof skills. Would love to hear more from you how we continue to focus on these professional skills. While it seems hard skills are so much more the focus, right? So much, everyone wants to teach someone how to code or this or that. How do professional skills keep up, rise to the top, knowing that they're so much more important at times?
It's so ironic that we call them soft skills when in reality they're the skills that are so much harder than any others. So where my career has taken me is that I now operate at the nexus of what we think of as what you need to know and who you need to be. Mm-hmm. So the what you need to know stuff can encompass those kind of technical skills that you're describing, but really my focus area is more on external vectors of change. Like what are all the things that are happening in the world that we need to be really acutely aware of? And as you and as our audience will well know, we're in a world right now where we're facing really dramatic change that is not out there. It is right here and now. Dramatic change in terms of technology, dramatic change in terms of climate change. I was looking at this morning at the photos and videos coming out of the flooding in China, the fires in the Northwest. We had some severe flooding here last week. Like it's just, kind of nonstop and will only continue to accelerate. Dramatic changes in terms of our societal expectations, our geopolitical landscape. And if we want to be effective leaders, we have to have a pretty robust and complex and nuanced understanding of these external vectors of change. Mm-hmm. Then the other piece of that is that we also need to have a deep understanding of who we are, who we want to be as leaders, and what kind of future we want to create. So we kind of suffer from this myth that the future is this like thing that's fixed and out there and static and waiting to happen to us, when in reality, the future is created by us, by the aggregation of choices that we make every day as leaders. And my work is about helping all of us understand that power that we have, understand that agency in the future that we create, and really rise to the challenge of the kind of leadership that we need in the face of all these really momentous changes we're experiencing.
Yeah. How do you teach that? Right. Earlier today, they mentioned how to learn. And I think you're sort of saying the same thing of early on learning how to look at all these external vectors and become a leader within them. How do you learn that? How do you learn how to do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, so that's obviously the skills that we've developed over a long career of helping people move along this curve. The first thing, typically in our approach, the first thing that we do is we kind of wake people up to the scale of the challenges that we're facing, right? So it's a very different thing to say lead with courage in a context where your biggest challenge is how you're going to continue to hit market expectations on a quarterly basis, right? And continue to churn out widgets at the same rate as you previously
Seems like
have.
it's always pen to paper. What are you showing me?
Yeah, and it's a totally different thing to say lead with courage when you're thinking about what is the role, in what way is your organization complicit in climate change? What is the role of your organization in advancing a narrative of diversity, equity, and inclusion? Like those are very different framings. And so the first thing that's really important for us is to kind of get the framing right, is to go, why is this important? What is the context in which we're asking these questions and asking these commitments of ourselves? And what that does is it opens us up to go, oh, it's no longer good enough for me to just know how to manage a team.
Yeah.
It's no longer good enough for me to just hit my quarterly financial metrics. I actually, the world needs me to step up to be a different kind of leader. And then we can go through what are the very specific and tangible skill sets that entails.
It seems like this has shifted over the last handful of years, where what you bring to the table as a hard skill set is sort of just ante to get into the game, to use a poker term.
It's table stakes.
Yeah, and the other things you see in companies and organizations now, it's much more of a focus on purpose. It's a much more of a focus on the flexibility that we just talked about. All these other things, and leaders and managers thinking, wow, I thought I was just, as you said, putting widgets in a line, but now it's much more complicated. You mentioned courage, so you don't always think about, you think leaders outside of work probably as courageous, but in work, courage is an interesting word to use as leaders. What do you mean by that? Is it courage to make the right decisions? Is it courage to disrupt, as Charlene mentioned, or is it courage to be vulnerable? Where on the spectrum are you thinking about courage?
Yeah, so any and all of those things. I just want to touch on something you raised in terms of the table stakes or the ante. I was just listening to a podcast with Danny Meyer from Union Square Hospitality Group, and he was saying that when they recruit, if you can do the technical work perfectly, let's say you can make the best bowl of pasta in the world consistently, if they're scoring candidates out of 100, that earns you 49 points. And the remaining 51 points comes from culture, from what he calls the hospitality quotient. We do a similar thing in our organization in terms of, hiring for not only skill, but culture, and how strongly we rate culture. So absolutely, that the technical skill should be just, a bare minimum. And then there's a whole bunch of other stuff that has to come along with that.
Yeah.
To answer your question about courage and courage in the organization, all of the things you described are essential. But one thing I will say is that what the research shows, it may be useful to come at it from a different angle. What the research shows is that the single biggest indicator of a lack of courage in an organization is an inability to have difficult conversations. And without the ability to have difficult conversations, nothing else works. You cannot have performance discussions. You cannot have
Right.
strategic discussions. You cannot have discussions about, pivoting or shifting direction. You can't have discussions about reviewing mistakes or errors or things that have gone wrong to see how you can learn. So without that baseline of courage to have difficult conversations, nothing else can talk about, forget about the bigger things that you touched on, disruption and, strategy. Like we can't even get the minimum things right if we don't have the courage to have difficult conversations.
Yeah.
And what we know, you mentioned vulnerability, what we know is that vulnerability is our single biggest indicator of courage. So if the biggest indicator of a lack of courage is an inability to have difficult conversations, our single biggest indicator of courage is vulnerability. And I'd love to, if I might just take a minute to share what I mean by that. So the definition of vulnerability, most of us associate or have associated vulnerability with weakness. I've certainly been guilty of that. That the definition of vulnerability that we're talking about here, and this comes from the training I did with Dr. Brene Brown a couple of years ago, is risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure. And so what I invite you to do, and what I invite everyone listening to do, is take a moment and call to mind a time when you saw someone doing something courageous. And it doesn't have to be something big and dramatic. It doesn't have to be the, I have a dream speech. It could be, someone standing up to their boss for the first time. It can be someone, saying no to an unreasonable request. It can be almost anything. And I want you to ask yourself, what role did vulnerability play in that moment?
Yeah.
Was that person taking a risk? Were they facing uncertainty? Were they opening themselves up to emotional exposure? And what you'll see is that you actually cannot have courage without vulnerability, because without risk, uncertainty, and emotional exposure, the thing you're doing isn't courage at all. It's just easy. So really understanding that within our organizations, if we cannot create an environment where difficult conversations, brave work, whole hearts are the norm, then we're going to continually struggle to tackle the major, major challenges that we're facing in the world.
Yeah, that's powerful. Thank you. I am going to reflect on that a ton tonight. When you think of future of work in a day like today, in skills, how does courage play into the future of work?
Courage is both, I'd say, an invitation and a muscle. So number one, I think that people who are embracing courage, who are willing to show up with courage, will be bringing so much more to the table than if they were not otherwise. In fact, the Dare to Lead curriculum, the work that I did in training with Brene Brown, came out of a research study where they started by asking 150 global C-suite executives, CEOs, CIOs, CFOs, what is the single most important characteristic for leaders to have heading into the future in the next 5, 10, 15 years and beyond? What will be the difference between the ones who are still standing and the ones who aren't? And the answer that came back was absolutely unequivocal, no close seconds. The number one characteristic we need from our leaders is courage. And so when we think about the future of work, my take is that not only do we as leaders need to be showing up with courage, but one of our single most important jobs is to cultivate courage on our teams, to cultivate environments where people are rewarded for acting courageously and where we are actively investing in growing our collective courage so that we can tackle the challenges we need to tackle.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I'm just trying to think in my own leadership in my company. This is a good conversation to have. One final thing as we wrap up here, you mentioned who you need to be, not just what you need to know. How do you think we give agency to figure out who you need to be?
Yeah. So it's really interesting, this idea of us giving agency, which is almost an oxymoron, right?
Creating agency.
Exactly. Inviting it really. And really our job is to help people realize that they had that agency all along, right? That in fact, so often we think that we are kind of stuck in the paradigm that was created by others and handed down to us, and that our only opportunity is to kind of go along with it. And in reality, we have heaps of choices that we just don't appreciate. We need to appreciate more.
Yeah. One final question that just came to mind. Where does mental health play into all of this, especially during COVID? isolation, just pressure, new technologies at play, figuring out a whole new world, racial justice, social justice. How does mental health come into all this, especially with courage or some of the other things you mentioned in terms of who we need to be?
Mental health is right at the heart of it. And in fact, our ability to set and maintain healthy boundaries to go, how do we look out for ourselves? That's at the heart of courage. It's at the heart of trust. And it's at the heart of our ability to continue to show up for others. I keep coming back to the good old oxygen mask. We have to put our own oxygen masks off first before we'll be any good to help anyone else.
Yeah. Wow. Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to have to travel to New Zealand just to have a day-long conversation with you.
Come on over. I'll pick you up at the airport.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. And I think everyone is going to breakout sessions now after a short break. So Kaila, have a great day over in New Zealand.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Bye.